FDA Monthly Podcast. I am Stephen Garvey, Executive Director of the Foundation for Democratic Advancement. Today I will present part 2 of the Salomon Commissiong interview on the upcoming U.S. presidential election and beyond. Solomon is an American educator, author, human rights activist, community and youth advocate, and executive director of Your World News Media Collective.
So how do you break that two-party system? Like, what would you advise Americans to do on November 6th?
I don't have any utopian type of reservations within my head, that I think that this happens easily. It doesn't happen easily. It's not going to happen easily, and it's not going to happen overnight. But when we look at the history of this country, America, which still, yes, is still riddled with social injustices and including institutional racism and so forth. In 2012, black people are getting paid 59 cents to every dollar that a white person is getting paid, and so it's clearly not the beacon of light for freedom, justice, and equality that they put out there. But we look at progress that was made in terms of ending hundreds of years of shadow slavery and over 100 years of Jim Crow. Those things didn't happen overnight, but there are individuals that are part of that process that literally, in some cases, gave their lives and to ending those things where they didn't see them in their lifetimes, but they served as stairs towards that eventual ending of shadow slavery, Jim Crow, and we see 64, 65 with the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and we still have a considerable amount of ways to go. But my point with that story is to say that when something that you're doing is deleterious to your overall well-being, such as, like, say you smoke cigarettes, the sooner you quit smoking cigarettes, and sooner you make that decision not to smoke, not to put another cigarette in your mouth and to smoke that, the greater your chances are of preserving your life years into the future. But the more cigarettes that you continue to smoke, unless you have some kind of super genes, most likely you are going to continue to take years and years off of your life. And so individuals have to be willing to take a step back and to see that, especially folks that routinely vote Democrat and thinking that the Democratic Party is like the party that is going to make a seismic difference socially within the country and within the world. That's just not the case. They're not going to make these quantum leaps forward. They're not going to make any even measurable leaps forward socially in America. And so the sooner people understand that the Democratic Party is beholden to their corporate interests first and foremost, and that their votes continue to serve as a part of the problem, not just my problem, but also their problem, their community's problem, the better they are for it. And they have to be willing to take a step back, to move away, and to say, you know what, either I'm going to abstain, I'm not going to vote for the lesser of two evils because I'm still voting for evil, and I'm just simply not going to vote at all. And I know that's not a popular thing to say. Or I'm going to make sure that I throw my weight behind the creation of a legitimate progressive third party, or throw my weight behind a party that exists right now, such as maybe perhaps the Green Party, and saying I'm going to throw my weight in support and start mobilizing and organizing on a very local level, so that more and more people within my community know what the Green Party is, what values they represent. And most of those people, if you can get them swayed, especially the ones that vote Democrat year in, year out, they're the ones that are the most open to be, the ones that are willing to sway their interests and their votes and their attention another way if you can mobilize and present that information in another way. But it has to start somewhere. You can't just routinely just say, I'm just going to vote for the lesser of two evils. You become part of the problem. And those of us that are activists, we have to continue to be consistent day in and day out, week in and week out, year in and year out, organizing and making sure that we can convey this message to folks. So not just saying don't vote for Barack Obama or the Democratic candidate either. Don't vote for the Republican, and don't vote for the Democratic candidate either. We have to explain to them why their vote is amounting to nothing, and then we have to present them with tangible alternatives or present them with divisions. We have to be visionaries. We have to be visionaries and have to put those visionary glasses on as many people as possible so that they can see an alternative to this messed up system. That they can see an end in sight, that there truly can be a system that is comprised of real representatives, a real representative democracy. Right now, the vast majority of folks that are in Congress, whether in the Senate or the House of Representatives, their interests are bought. Their interests have been bought a long time ago, and that's why we see Democrats as well routinely voting to fund routinely voting to fund wars, military. $1 trillion a year is spent on military expenditures, Stephen. 800 to 1,000 U.S. military bases can be found throughout the world. Now, you don't think that if there was a true progressive party that really could start to suck up some of the seats in Congress and in the Senate, you don't think that could play a major role in terms of folks putting bills that would not just shrink the military budget by closing those military bases and bringing some of those troops home so that they could come home, they can be home, and they can serve within a military here that is actually for good, where it could be used, to help people out in terms of natural disasters, like such as the case in Hurricane Katrina and those folks that sat there for days and days and days and end when they could have sent in helicopters and they could have sent in military to go in there to air vac folks out immediately and bring them food and water. Those individuals can be brought home. The military can be shrunk down by shutting down the military bases. And what do we do with the difference of that money? The difference of that money can be thrown into a universal healthcare system, a real universal healthcare system, making sure that everybody has Medicare for all. If you want a private, fancy, whatever, so be it. But everyone that is uninsured now has the opportunity to be insured in a system that is everybody in and nobody out, a real universal healthcare system. And then we start to set our sights on things like free tertiary education, where you guys have that in Canada. Quebec province, or was it, I believe this year, where students got out and they're still protesting just the thought that the state might increase their tuition to something that here in America would be seen as paltry, something around like $1,000 U.S. I mean, in America, the average college student is graduating with $25,000 in debt. There's $1 trillion of student loan debt that is floating out there in America, in American society right now, and much of it is facing default. A more humane society, that money from closing those military bases and shutting down military programs like AFRICOM, and bringing that money back home and putting it into a Medicare for all system, putting it into free tertiary education, free Head Start for parents, and their children. That's seeing a more humane society being built. That's seeing a society now that is finally putting people before profits and not putting profits before people. And so these things have to be articulated, but they have to be done neighbor to neighbor, community to community, in town halls, in discussions, in apartments and forums of that nature, and they have to be done on a consistent basis, a real sustained social revolution, not just some kind of fancy, trendy thing. And I'd like to think that myself and some of my very close comrades in the D.C. area, we're in the midst of doing things like that right now. We're right now in building an organization that is aimed to do things just like that. And we're about a month away from launching this organization, but we all have to be visionaries in some shape, form, or fashion, and we all have to be willing to play our role and to support one another.
One could argue that the U.S. needs those military bases to protect its interests, but also to expand its interests. For example, protecting commercial interests in Asia, or even in Eastern Europe, and use the military to make sure that they're protected. How would you respond to that argument?
Well, I would agree. I mean, the current day America, yeah, that's why we have to build a new society. That's why we have to build a new society, because right now in 2012, Obama knows this. I mean, he's part of that system. I mean, he's very much interested in protecting America's quote unquote interests, and those interests, as you know, Stephen, those interests happen to be interests that support these large corporations and those resources. And so we look at, for instance, the African continent. We see AFRICOM. AFRICOM is the neo-colonization of Africa through a militarized, a U.S. militarized African continent that is completely backed by the U.S. I mean, they have part of AFRICOM is in places like Djibouti right now. Before, and it was operating solely from Stuttgart, Germany. My point is that the U.S.'s presence in Africa is to secure its interests, because they feel that, there's this encroachment, the Chinese are doing this, that, and the other. There's oil here in Africa. There's platinum. There's uranium. There's gold. There's bauxite. There's tin. There's copper. All this stuff that is in abundance in continents like Africa, and you can also find in other continents like South America. And so the U.S. sees its interest there, and its interest is a very self-serving perspective. They couldn't give a damn about the people in that continent that really should be the primary beneficiaries of those resources. The U.S. could give a damn. They could give a damn about justice. So if you're a dictator in the U.S. and you're repressive, you're part of a repressive regime, the U.S. won't say a damn word about you. They will continue to be your ally, and as long as you allow them to serve their interests, as long as you make it easy for them to secure and serve their interests in your country, such as the example with Uganda and Yoweri Museveni, who has blood all over his hands to this day. And the U.S. won't say a darn word about him. They won't say a darn negative word about him. Why? Because he allows the U.S. to come in there and to exercise war games, such as the one they did a few years ago, Operation Thunder and Lightning, and allows them to strategically position themselves in East Africa and the Great Lakes region. Yeah, one would argue that, Stephen. Yeah, one would. A right winger, just a basic dumbass American would argue that. Those of us that want to see a new society, a different society, we have to kind of spell it out and explain to folks that this is not going to benefit you in any shape, form, or fashion. And what this does is continues to show America in a very, very nasty light, where people are not going to see it in any good way, shape, form, or fashion. This is an opportunity to shut down these military bases, bring these troops home, these individuals, many of which are people who are forced into the military because of their socioeconomic status, because of their social and living conditions, lack thereof, and bring them home so that their lives are preserved, so they're not killed trying to serve the interests of large corporations that don't give a damn about them, as they're in the process of killing other people who share far more similarities with them than they do the corporations that they're fighting for. Bring them home, and when you bring them home, you bring that money home. You have to see. And it's not going to be easy, but what we have to see the shutting down of these military bases as a major part of this whole process. And with that, obviously, when you shut down the bases, when you shut down U.S. encroachment on other people's resources, then by and large, what you're also going to see is you're going to see these wars, these imperialist wars, because these wars are fought based on imperialism, based on global dominance. And so when you change that spear, then you're changing the whole specter of war and how we know it, and we're shutting down these wars, shutting them down completely, and bringing that money home. And when you look at that, all these folks that say, there's no money to do this, that, and the other, and there's no money, we'll break the bank, and this, that, and the other. Listen, we decreased the U.S. military budget by even 20 to 30%. And you're going to see major gains in things like healthcare right at the jump. And I'll end on this, Stephen, in terms of that question. Most Americans don't even understand that 44% of their federal taxes go towards the military. 44% go towards the military. 44%. They don't even realize that you're not given an opportunity to pick and choose where you want your federal taxes to go. 44% of your taxes are going there. So, but you have these, it becomes really difficult sometimes, Stephen, but you can't even laugh to keep from crying. You just have to cry. Like when you see people just say these things and they're just parroting what they've heard their favorite politician say, or what they heard their favorite news announcer say when they're saying like, oh, well, you look at Canada, Canada and Norway and other countries in Europe and north of the border, look at how much they're paying in taxes. And then my answer to them is like, listen, you dumbass, like, what are you getting for your taxes? 44% of your taxes are going to the military. But then overall, what are you getting for your taxes? You got a kid whose teeth are rotting out, and you don't have any dental care or health care to help take care of them. What do you have? You have this ailment, and we know the number one reason why Americans go bankrupt. It's because of a lack of health insurance, and they go bankrupt because of medical bills. That's the primary reason why Americans go bankrupt. What are you getting in return for your taxes? At least in places like Norway, when you look at the taxes that they're paying, look what they get in return. They get free tertiary education. They have a livable wage over there, which was a long struggle that was won by unions in that country. And you look at health care. They have universal health care, where they're not paying a dime if they get sick or what have you. What are you getting in return? And then that's when, by way of just challenging these people to think for the first time about things that they're not supposed to think about, they just are kind of stuck there. And they either have no response back, or they'll just kind of give some lame non-response back. But at least you know that you put them in a position where they actually have to think about something that has been purposely left off of their mental radar for quite some time.
Your vision for U.S. foreign policy, for example, would be going into a country and working with the people of that country in a respectful way, whereby U.S. companies buy uranium or potash, silver, gold, etc., but they would do it in a respectful way without actually trying to fund a coup d'etat to get someone in there who can make it change all the policies in their favor. Is that correct? Kind of in a nutshell?
Yeah. I mean that would be a start. I mean, first and foremost, diplomatically, you have to go in there. Diplomatically, the U.S. can't, by starters, cannot go in there, demanding terms and so forth, as if that land was their land.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be some kind of, and if this government decides to trade with you, then it has to be fair trade. It would have to be fair trade, but the terms of that trade should be negotiated by those governments itself. But before that even happens, when the U.S. military, bases are shut down and so forth, and in this new society that we're envisioning, Stephen, before the U.S. even asks to go in there for resources, there has to be some healing, simply based on the not just years but decades and decades and decades of just carnage that U.S. foreign policy has caused that country and its people. And so before that, the U.S. even opens their mouth about asking for some kind of trade partnership, some kind of fair trade partnership with this country, I would say, for instance, like in certain countries, that there would have to be a healing process. There has to be some kind of resolution, like some kind of resolution. But Stephen, part of that, I would say, would have to be with some kind of reparations package, because based on the country, because some of these countries have been so devastated by U.S. imperialism that they're still recovering to this day. Take, for instance, Guatemala, because of what the CIA, United States Central Intelligence Agency, and the corporations that it was acting on behalf of, such as United Fruit Company. Guatemala, to this day, has not recovered from the coup d'etat that they did, that took out in 1954 Cabo Arbenz from the seat of power in that country, where this man, wasn't even a communist. I mean, they said he was a communist, as if even if he was a communist, who the hell? You have no right to go in there and instigate a coup d'état. If that country happens to be socialist or communist, that's none of your damn business. You can have your opinions. That's none of your damn business in terms of you exercising your military might. But I just bring that up because the U.S. put out this propaganda that he was communist and so forth, and this, that, and the other. And so the CIA supported this coup, and the man was trying to redistribute. He was trying to redistribute land to peasant farmers. He had a land reform project for peasant farmers. And that's where we get this whole term banana republic. But so the U.S. makes it possible for United Fruit, which is today otherwise known as Chiquita, the Chiquita Banana Corporation, and as we know, they do other fruits as well. But it's known as Chiquita today. In their interest, in their corporation's interest, they were the ones that remained in control of the vast banana plantations, and not the people, not the farmers of Guatemala. And to this day, Guatemala still happens to be one of the most economically poor countries in the Western Hemisphere, and it's all courtesy of the United States government. All courtesy of the United States government. So there would have to be some kind of reparation, something that is. And we also know that Guatemalan citizens, they were biologically experimented on, just like the black men in the Tuskegee experiment. There were Guatemalans who by way of U.S. Scientists and doctors, they were injected with things like syphilis. And the U.S. government actually finally admitted this last year. They had no choice but to admit it. There was overwhelming evidence. State Department admitted it and issued an apology. But beyond that, there needs to be reparations, because these people have been suffering and have not recovered. And that's just one country out of many that I could name, Stephen. But that has to happen first. That has to be part of that resolution, that healing process.
Right.
There has to be some kind of reparations, and then once real, fair, equal diplomatic ties are established, then you can move into this whole conversation about fair trade and so forth. But not until then.
Yeah, I think one has to be careful with the notion of fair trade even. We just recently interviewed someone who had done research in Colombia. The Canadian government has followed the American government down there, with the U.S. military leading the way. And now Canadian mining companies, oil companies are down there doing business with the Colombian government, which is probably considered fascist, and they have death squads, and they're killing indigenous people and unionists, and the Canadian government turns a blind eye as long as their Canadian companies are benefiting. This is no different than the U.S., but the U.S. paved the way, and the term Canada is neo-colonial in that sense. In the sense that they're not using the military, but they're going in and exploiting.
That's right.
We actually tried to get interviews from the Canadian MPs and trade minister, but they've ignored us. They don't want Canadians to know about this issue.
Exactly right.
It's not only happening in the U.S. I want you to know that there's a lot of issues in the Canadian political system. We just finished doing work, and basically the Prime Minister in Canada has dictatorial powers and unlimited terms. He appoints so many different high-end positions. It can remove anyone from the parliament. That person doesn't have to be elected. Is not directly elected by the people, and on and on. Just so you know, there are issues up here as well.
No, I'm very familiar with the right-wing Stephen Harper administration up there as well. And one of my comrades up there, I don't know if it's Asid Ismi that you.
Yeah, it was him. It's actually the most recent podcast.
Yeah, he's awesome, and he's shed light, and as you can see when you ask me that question, you have to be very careful with even fair trade, and that's what I was saying. Like before there's even any kind of discussion of trade, there has to be some kind of healing process, but that can't happen until the U.S. repays these countries and for the loss of life and land and resources by way of some kind of reparations package, because otherwise it's not even in the best interest of those countries. It's just best to keep their distance from the U.S. and truly work towards being an independent sovereign entity, not one that is that is a puppet client of the U.S. by virtue of having some kind of right-wing puppet that exists, at the seat of power, as we saw with Uribe in Colombia, and now we see with Santos, who still, may not be as openly, right-wing as Uribe, but still represents the interests of U.S. masters and the corporations there, and the military bases that exist in Colombia, saying that still exist there. And so you're exactly right. And I didn't know he was on your show, but
he was last time, and he shed light on all that. The revolving door in Colombia,
right,
where the ministers in the Colombian government get into these corporations, whether U.S., Canadian, European, and then they allow them to bulldoze the rights of Colombians. In the case of Bolivia, the Bolivia government's different. They just seized a Canadian mining operation down there because they were violating indigenous rights, and then the Canadian government's protesting. But these are indigenous rights in Bolivia that they need to be respected. But if that was in Colombia, they would either get killed or pushed out.
Yeah.
Interesting. So this is all coming down to values, isn't it? Like respect for other human beings and your basic ethical, moral values, and how you look at yourself and others. Would you say?
Yeah, I totally agree. In America, man, Stephen, you just hit it on right there. I mean, exactly. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because this is something that I talk about a lot. Is that when we look at changing society and changing the whole specter of social justice globally, we can't look at things, and I'm not talking about race. We can't look at things black and white. There are so many different intersectionalities and all these different wires that are connected. But you have to get down to the basics. So, for instance, like when you look at America, you're right. Americans are trained at a very, very early age. I mean, you can make a major, major difference, and they know this. I mean, so when I say this, I'm not just being idealistic. I'm talking about strategy. They know, and so our strategy, those of us that are human rights activists, part of our strategy is on the complete opposite side of what the ruling elite's strategy is. And their strategy, has a lot to do with education as well. That's why they want to educate or miseducate and misinform the masses through their media, but not just their media, but even within the school system, looking at the schooling in America. And I'm just mentioning America because that's what we're talking about right now. Mm-hmm. Look at, for instance, on the elementary school level. I mean, kids, regardless of what color they are, white kids are taught subconsciously to continue to be racist or to be at the very least white supremacists. I mean, they're taught songs like, "My Country, 'Tis of Thee," "Sweet Land of Liberty." I ask your listeners to just even Google that song. That's a song that kids are asked to sing in elementary school. And "Land of My Father's Pride." No mention of indigenous Americans. No mention of Native Americans in there whatsoever. And it's a very white supremacist song as you go from verse to verse within, I think it's 4 or 5 verses. You look at this country here. I mean, even within that song, it teaches you in that song that Europeans are the indigenous ones in America. They're the rightful owners of this land. That song lays out that false narrative of that. No mention whatsoever. And so going to America's classrooms, kids are taught nothing about the struggle and resistance and what happened to Native Americans. They're not accurately taught about how their economic system, capitalism, was built up on the back of chattel slavery. They're not taught any range of things. And so when they advance to an age and a grade where they start to study social studies, they're getting their social studies narrative almost as if the State Department was giving it to them. So they're taught except to adopt the same enemies as these amoral hooligans that are in power in Washington. Everyone from Hillary Clinton and the rest of them, whether it's the State Department, whether it's the White House, whether it's the Pentagon, they're taught to accept these kind of so it's a very very sick society. It's an extremely sick society. It's a society, but just that needs serious rehabilitation. Just like a sick person, or a person that is just sick, or someone that's mentally sick, that may be a sociopath. I look at the U.S. government and by and large part U.S. society as being a very sociopathic society. And you see it. It's very non-appreciative society when it comes to human life and humanity. And so these individuals, and the sad thing is, because I try to spend a lot of time with kids, because I like to work with kids more than I do adults my age and even older, because children don't have as many layers of ignorance caked on them. So they're willing to unlearn certain things in order to learn. And they ask all the questions. They ask all the right questions. The why. The older we get, it seems that the more non-critical, the more non-analytical we become, and we don't ask those questions why. But you look at how Americans have turned into kind of like these bloodthirsty animals. Is whenever the U.S. says, oh, we're going to go in there and start bombing a certain country, Americans start to cheer. They start to cheer. I mean, look what happened after 9/11. So you would have thought that any society where they just had something as traumatic as what happened on 9/11 happened to them, that they would understand the importance of human life, and especially human life that is not culpable, you know what I'm saying,
Mm-hmm.
For the actions of a
Right.
few. You would have thought they would understand that, but what is the first thing they did, Stephen, is that when Bush said we're going to go get them, they didn't even ask the question, who's them? Them? What? They didn't even ask that question. No, in November of 2001, when the U.S. started its airstrikes in Afghanistan, they were, go get them. They were bloodthirsty animals, and we now know that the vast majority of people, over 3,000 people, more people were killed, more innocent civilians were killed in Afghanistan in those initial airstrikes than were killed on U.S. soil on 9/11. But Americans, they didn't give a damn. They didn't care, because an Afghan civilian that was killed there, they might as well have been a Martian. They might as well have been a cockroach to them. You know what I'm saying? It don't matter. Our government says that they're responsible. Go get them. And then going into Iraq, and now we know, close to 1 million Iraqi civilians perhaps have been killed in the U.S. and NATO aftermath, which as well as Americans, this is a dialogue that is not discussed, because Americans, Stephen, they're bloody sheep. They don't think about these things. And so if their media is not bringing it up, civilians, they don't bring it up. And so I'll say this last, Stephen. One thing that's real interesting, when the veil has been raised, and on the specter of war and so forth, such as Iraq, when folks, politicians started to say, oh, we got to, I'm talking about like Democrats mostly, you started to say, oh, we got to bring them home. We got to bring them home. Oftentimes, the justification for ending a specific war, Stephen, the justification is either A, money, or B, U.S. troops and their lives. Not within that sentence is we need to end this war as well, because it's taking civilian lives. So very few will ever even bring that up. So it's like, oh, bring the money. We got to stop the loss of the U.S. soldiers' lives, and we got to bring the money home. Not even forget those Afghan civilians. They're not even thinking about them. They're not even thinking about them as well. They have been pathologically programmed to think that way. There's a thing called American exceptionalism, Stephen,
Mm-hmm.
and that way of thinking, which is even broadcast on these little cute commercials on stations like MSNBC, where you have Chris Matthews that talking blowhard on Hardball, who had this little commercial, and he's like, that's American exceptionalism at its best. That's American exceptionalism. Well, American exceptionalism is like, in essence, is the thought process that America is the sun, and it's for the rest of the world to revolve around America, to revolve around America as if it is the sun. The rest of the world revolves around it. Our interests are number one, and our interests need to be met, and by any means, we were going to achieve our end game to justify the securing of our interests, which is code for the securing of our corporate elites and our global interests and the ruling class, whether it's in Chile in 1973, taking out Allende, in Congo in 1960, taking out the democratically elected Patrice Lumumba. they'll do it all. They are pathological. If you looked at this government as if it was a human being, it would be nothing short of a serial killer. It would be a pathological serial killer that is devoid of any kind of morals, any kind of conscience, I should say, whatsoever, that keeps them in pace with their humanity, keeps them lined up with humanity to say, you know what, perhaps I shouldn't do this because it's going to hurt far more people than it's going to help. There is no moral compass whatsoever. It's completely,
Right.
and that's why I said this work, needs to be done, and that's why programs like yours need to continue to go on in perpetuity, because people have to hear these alternative perspectives that they're simply not going to hear on corporate media airwaves in the U.S. And so it takes a Canadian show like yours, to be one of those many shows out there that is trying to continue to shape public policy, and that providing information is a very important, means of achieving that goal.
Thank you very much for listening in to this episode of the Foundation for Democratic Advancement's podcast. For the FDA to continue to improve democratic processes worldwide, we rely upon your generous donations. Donate to the FDA. Please visit our website at www.democracychange.org. To learn more about our mission, vision, and work, you can also visit us on Facebook and on Twitter. Thank you very much for listening, and we look forward